When the battle ended, silence crawled over the blackened earth. The air, thick with ash and blood, carried the echo of screams fading into nothing. Shields lay cracked in the mud, swords still dripping, and bodies, hundreds of them, were strewn across the frozen ground. The men were gone. Their agony, brief as lightning, was over. But for the wives who waited behind the burning walls, for the daughters clutching at corpses, the nightmare had only just begun. The sagas would later sing of glory, of fearless warriors and shining blades. But the poets never wrote of what happened after. They never wrote of the chains, iron cuffs shaped to fit women's wrists, ankle rings no wider than a child's leg. They never mentioned the stench that hung over the rivers where captives were marched like cattle, or the hollow cries that came from the ships before they vanished into the horizon. In Dublin, archaeologists unearthed the truth, buried beneath centuries of soil. Shackles rusted shut around delicate bones, stone cells blackened by smoke and tears. Here markets once thrived, not for silver, not for gold, but for flesh. A young woman could be bought for 20 silver coins. A mother, 15. One who fought back or bled during capture, 10. These were not whispers of legend. They were numbers carved into runestones, etched in cold permanence, the price of humanity reduced to stone receipts. The monks who recorded the raids wrote of slaughtered priests and burned altars, then stopped their pens in silence. But the ground beneath their ruined abbeys still tells the rest. Soil soaked with blood, fractured skulls struck from behind, children's bones scattered among animal remains, proof of an atrocity too monstrous for parchment. And yet this horror was not born of madness. It was system, not chaos, and a deliberate design. To the Vikings, every victory brought spoils, and the greatest spoils were not crowns or chalices, but living bodies. Every raid fed an empire of slavery that stretched from the Irish coast to the markets of the east. So when the smoke cleared and the ravens gathered to feed, the true harvest began. Not of grain, not of gold, but of women. They were the trophies of conquest, stripped of names, of futures, of mercy. Their fates sealed not on the battlefield, but in the cold commerce of men who believed the gods demanded it. For the fallen warriors, death was release. For their wives and daughters, it was the beginning of something far worse. The ground remembers what men tried to forget. In the cold bogs of Ireland, archaeologists uncover what the monks never dared to record: bones of women lying face down in the peat. Their skulls shattered from behind, ribs splintered, arms frozen mid-defensive gesture. These were not soldiers. These were mothers, daughters, captives. Their deaths were not chaos. They were verdicts, deliberate ritualized executions carried out days after the fighting ended. By the year 871, the great heathen army marched across England, seizing Reading and slaughtering its defenders. The chronicles tell of a fallen king, of brave resistance crushed beneath the Viking tide. But not a single word was written of the royal women. Their story is written instead in iron oxide, in red stains seeping through the stone floors of the Saxon palace, stains that no rain could wash away. The Norse had a law for everything, even for the ownership of flesh. Under their code, when a man died in battle, his wife did not become free. She became property, the rightful possession of his killer. They called her Kona, meaning owned woman. Her breath was not her own. Her body was not her own. Her silence was mandatory. The ritual of claiming was public, legal, and cruel. The captor stood before witnesses declaring her his wife, while she was forced to kneel. No consent, no choice, and only law. Even the Icelandic Sagas codes preserved this as procedure. In Norse society, rape was not a crime. It was an institution. It had form witnesses and the authority of gods and men. Archaeological digs at Reading confirm what the texts conceal. The stones themselves speak. Fragments of jewelry torn from necks, splinters of bone embedded in walls, and shallow graves dug hurriedly near palace ruins. Some bodies were found headless, others bound. Each tells the same story, that of women converted into spoils, their suffering legitimized by written law. And when the Norsemen feasted, drinking mead from silver goblets stolen from church altars, they toasted not just to victory but to possession. To them, conquest was not complete until it had claimed the women of the fallen. So the earth became their witness, a graveyard of forgotten wives, buried without names, without prayers. The monks stayed silent. The sagas looked away, and time covered the evidence in moss and soil. But the ground does not lie. Beneath every Viking monument, beneath every tale of valor and gods, the bones still whisper, not of glory but of ownership, cruelty, and the quiet agony of the Kona. When the fires of conquest dimmed, the rituals of death began. Across the north, at monasteries reduced to ash and villages drowned in smoke, the line between worship and horror vanished. Among the Norse, death was not an ending, it was theatre. Every chieftain's funeral became a stage for devotion, blood, and obedience. When a Viking lord fell, his wives and slaves were chosen to follow him. Not by will but by decree. The living were to accompany the dead, their bodies offered as proof of loyalty. Chronicles tell of the processions, the chanting warriors, the scent of pine pitch and burning herbs, and the women led forward in silence. One among them would be named the Death Maiden. She was promised honor in the afterlife, though her honor would begin in torment. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan witnessed such a rite on the banks of the Volga. A slave girl volunteered, or seemed to. She was given strong drink laced with henbane, a poison that dulled the senses and clouded the mind. Then, in full view of the crowd, she was violated, strangled, and laid beside her master on the pyre. As the flames rose, drums thundered and horns cried out. For the Norse, this was no crime. It was a sacred exchange. Blood for glory, flesh for immortality. Archaeologists now confirm what the chroniclers feared to write. Boat burials across Scandinavia hold the remains of women whose neck bones show rope burns, whose teeth carry narcotic residue. They were made to walk willingly into death, half drugged, half aware, trapped in a final hallucination as the pyres consumed them. The Norse called it devotion. The truth was far darker. It was power displayed as ritual, cruelty recast as faith. Women became vessels for male salvation. Their suffering a sacrifice meant to sanctify violence. Each death an echo of control disguised as custom. For the blonde captive taken from the conquered coasts, this was the fate whispered in nightmares. To die beside a man she never chose, her body turned into an offering to gods she did not believe in. When the flames burned low and the chanting faded, only ashes and bone remained. Yet among the ruins, the air still carried the scent of the herbs used to cloud their minds. A final act of mercy, or of mockery. The Norse called it honor. But beneath the gold and the songs, it was nothing more than cruelty made divine. By the 10th century, the Viking world had changed. No longer did their wealth flow from gold ripped from monasteries or silver taken from kings. Now it came from bodies, living, breathing commodities. Their empire was built not on honor or exploration, but on chains. Dublin became the beating heart of this new trade. What began as a raider's haven turned into the largest human marketplace in northern Europe. For 60 years the docks were rebuilt, expanded, fortified, not to hold cargo or grain, but to hold people. Beneath the surface, stone cellars stretched like labyrinths, their floors carved with narrow drainage channels to carry away the filth of hundreds imprisoned inside. The smell of rot and despair clung to the air like fog. Each week, longships arrived heavy with captives from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England itself. The young were sorted by strength and beauty, sent north to breed new generations of servants for Norse farms. The older, the injured, the hopeless, were marched eastward in chained columns along the great rivers, through Novgorod, through Kiev, until they reached the glittering slave markets of Baghdad. There, pale-skinned women from the Western Isles were displayed like relics of ivory. Buyers examined their hair, their teeth, their eyes as though judging livestock. They fetched the highest prices of all, trophies of conquest, proof of wealth. To the traders they were wares. To the gods they were offerings. To themselves they were ghosts still trapped in bodies that were no longer their own. Everywhere the Vikings settled, the same pattern emerged. York, Birka, Hedeby, Ribe. Each town had its pens and counting tables, its record keepers and guards. Each ran on precision, a bureaucracy of cruelty. Every life was measured, weighed, recorded in runes and silver. There was nothing random about it. Archaeologists have found the proof. Stone rings for tethering chains, warehouses large enough for 200 captives, ledgers scratched into wooden tablets listing 5 for the farm, 10 for the east. This was not barbarism without order. It was order perfected through barbarism. And amid it all was the blonde woman, one among thousands. She had become a number on a slate, a mark of trade, a body waiting to be shipped. When her longship departed Dublin's harbour, she watched the city shrink behind her, its towers glimmering in gold sunlight, and knew she was leaving one prison for another. The sagas would later speak of heroes, explorers, and kings. But in truth, it was the chained, the voiceless, and the souled who built the Viking Empire, an empire of flesh fed by the silence of the dead. There were horrors even the chronicles dared not describe, punishments crafted not for justice, but for spectacle. The Norse had many ways to break a captive, but the most merciless were reserved for those who resisted. When Irish forces reclaimed Dublin in 914, they did not find gold or silver or ships. They found the earth itself desecrated. Beneath the ruined fortifications were pits, deep, narrow shafts lined with stone, each barely wide enough for a human body. Inside lay the remnants of women, bones crushed, ribs splintered, skulls cracked open like pottery. Some had died sitting upright, others twisted at impossible angles. They had not been killed in battle. They had been buried alive. The sagas call it the judgment of defiance. Norse law declared that if an enslaved woman harmed or defied her master, she was to be cast into the ground. The pit was her prison, her tomb, and her punishment. It was not deep enough to stand, not long enough to lie down. Air came in thin draughts through cracks in the stone. Water pooled at the bottom, cold and fetid. Days might pass before death arrived. Some pits were crueler still, filled with sharp stones that tore the skin as the women tried to move. Others were flooded deliberately, drowning the condemned an inch at a time. Archaeologists found traces of nails and wood slats above the openings, covers that kept the victims from escaping, but allowed the air and the screams to rise. The Norse called it order. The victims called it eternity. And for the others, those still alive, it was a lesson carved into memory. Captives were forced to stand nearby, to watch the slow deaths of their companions. Each gasp, each plea was a warning, obedience or the pit. Even after the Norse were driven from Dublin, their laws lingered like a curse. The Irish chroniclers wrote of the holes of death, where women's voices once echoed beneath the soil. In time, those voices faded, replaced by silence, but the ground never healed. The pits remained, filled with bones and shadows. Centuries later, when the earth was dug again, the soil still bore traces of their agony, fractured stone, rusted chains, and the unmistakable marks of human nails against the rock. The Vikings had vanished, but their cruelty had not. It was written in the land itself, a history not of conquest or courage, but of slow death whispered through the cold breath of the Irish wind. As the Viking Age drew toward its end, the storms that once carried their ships began to turn against them. The same warriors who had burned kingdoms and enslaved nations now watched their own strongholds fall. The power that had once seemed eternal began to crumble from within, and with it came a madness unlike anything they had inflicted on others. When defeat loomed, mercy vanished. The chronicles fall silent, but the graves speak louder than any words. At Repton, once a Viking encampment, later a burial ground, archaeologists unearthed a mass grave of 236 women. The bones told a story the sagas refused to remember: crushed skulls, signs of strangulation, traces of poison still clinging to the teeth. These women were not victims of conquest. They were Norse-born, wives, daughters, mothers. Their killers were their own kin. It was the ultimate reversal. For generations, the Vikings had enslaved, branded, and sold the women of other lands. But when their own cities fell, when their armies fractured and the enemy closed in, they turned the same brutality inward. The logic was twisted but simple: better death by one's own hand than dishonor in another's chains. Among the remains, one discovery froze even the seasoned researchers in silence. A young girl's skull, small and delicate, carved with runes that read, "I'm better this way." She was no older than 14. The inscription had been made after death, the mark shallow and hesitant, as if by a trembling hand, perhaps her father's, perhaps her brother's, in a final attempt to justify the unthinkable. The soil layers at Repton show the killings occurred over several days, not in panic, but with dreadful order. The bodies were laid carefully, row by row, their faces turned toward the same direction, north toward the homeland they would never see again. It was ritual and remorse fused together, a final act of mercy twisted by despair. They had spent centuries building an empire of cruelty, and in the end, that cruelty devoured them. The same laws, the same logic, the same hands that once bound foreign women in chains now ended the lives of their own. And above the graves, when the wind moves through the grass, it carries whispers that no one can quite explain. Echoes of a people who learned, too late, that the monsters they feared had always been themselves. Not every woman knelt. Some learned to strike back. In 923, across the shattered remnants of Norse rule, one name began to echo in whispered fear: Gunhild. Once a captive herself, she had escaped carrying the scars of iron and fire. She knew Viking tactics, their patrol routes, the weak points in their fortresses, but most of all she knew their arrogance, the belief that no woman could ever defy them. For 7 relentless years, she proved them wrong. Gunhild gathered freed captives, widows, and outcasts, an army of the forgotten. Her band struck like ghosts, appearing by night to torch Viking outposts and slaughter the traders who had once trafficked them. Her vengeance was systematic, almost surgical. Chronicles record that she destroyed 12 Norse strongholds and freed hundreds of slaves. No captives were taken, no mercy shown. Every trader she found was executed, often by the same brands they had used on others. To the Franks she became a legend. To the surviving Vikings a curse. Villages whispered that Gunhild's eyes burned like embers, that she carried a necklace of melted silver from the slave rings she had broken. Even after her final raid, the massacre at Rouen, her trail vanished. But in the charred soil of those burned settlements, archaeologists would one day find the truth. Scorched chains, shattered manacles, and fragments of women's jewelry fused by fire. Someone had indeed hunted the hunters, yet Gunhild's vengeance could not cleanse the stain left behind. The Viking system did not die with its men. It adapted. When the Normans rose to power, they inherited the same machinery of cruelty. The Domesday Book, England's great record of property, listed women alongside livestock and ploughs. Castles across Normandy and England contained windowless stone cells reserved for female captives. Infants born of conquest, children of rape, were quietly discarded, their existence erased before it could be written. The conquerors changed their banners and tongues, but not their nature. Gunhild's rebellion became a story of fire and then a silence. Her name faded from chronicles written by men who preferred victors to avengers. But in every burned outpost, in every ruin where iron and bone are found together, there lingers the ghost of her defiance. A reminder that even in the darkest age, one woman's fury could set an empire ablaze. Centuries passed before the earth began to speak again. What history buried, science unearthed. Beneath the myths of conquest and honor, a darker inheritance waited to be measured, not in legends, but in blood. Mitochondrial DNA told a story no saga had recorded. The maternal lines of modern Scandinavia traced back not to proud Viking queens, but to Celtic and Saxon women carried north as slaves. Their bloodlines stretched across Iceland and Norway, silent witnesses to generations of captivity. This was not the blending of cultures. It was the arithmetic of conquest, written into the genome of a people. In the heart of York, archaeologists uncovered the truth the church had paved over. 64 stone cells, cold and windowless, each built to contain one woman. The walls bore the scars of chains, the floors carved with grooves that drained filth and blood. It was not a prison. It was a breeding house. Women were forced to bear children they would never raise, infants taken before they could even cry a second time. Records from York Minster confirmed the horror. Over 700 baptisms were recorded from that site. Only 12 of those children lived beyond the age of 5. The others disappeared into the silence between scripture and stone. Even holiness had a price. The church received silver for every birth, sanctifying suffering with ledgers and blessings. "Hand still," the ground whispered. Beneath Repton, where Norse women had once been buried, archaeologists found new layers, hundreds of graves stacked upon one another, spanning generations. Some bones carried traces of mercury and lead, poisons administered slowly to drive the mind into madness before death. Others were mothers buried with infants, their final gesture one of protection that came too late. Then, from one skull, a familiar mark emerged, 3 runic words, carved with deliberate precision. Better this way. The same message found a century earlier, repeated by hands that had inherited both cruelty and despair. Perhaps it was meant as mercy, perhaps as madness, but the meaning remains the same, the desperate attempt to give purpose to horror. And so the story ends where it began, not in the songs of kings or the glory of conquest, but in the silence of women turned to dust, their voices erased, their bones left to speak for them. They were not forgotten by time, they were consumed by it.